Feel like we've had great success avoiding little glitches here and there, but every now and again you're going to have one with our videos. So these guys are re-racking the film on the film projector.
Yep.
Oh wait. Bottom line, we're going to get to it as soon as is possible. They're going to figure out the video. And if not, you know, we got the man who is in the video right here, so we're going to try to deal with it. But interesting, the conversation that was just happening off the air. We do not remain silent in between these sets. You were talking a little bit more about Spintron, and what Warren was saying. People are very interested in the pressure on the valve train, and Warren was kind of delving into that area a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the questions, or a couple of the questions, had been about, well, the Spintron doesn't simulate the effects of the pressure or negative pressure in the valve train, or I say in the intake tract in the exhaust. Well, you know, as Warren was talking about earlier, there's all of these dynamics, these pressure waves. Even Billy was talking about it in his, that you've got these pressure waves. So that pressure isn't static, it's very dynamic. And the whole other part of this to me is that, okay, so if you take the fact that it's a variable and it's going to change engine by engine, well, by not having that, then you're reducing the noise that could confound your information, because really at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make that valve train system stable. And the big key in it, going back to Randy and his excitement and everything jumping around, yep, baby with the thing, is that part going on in the valve train is the spring is being energized. So when the spring is being energized, that's where you got to calm down, and you're never going to find that pressurizing the manifold. You're going to find it by watching that valve motion and doing it with the Spintron. So
there you go. All right, it sounds like they've got everything re-racked and ready to roll. We're going to try once again. Back to the video, and then more with Ben Strader.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Ben at EFI University. Keith Jones from Total Seals with me again. And you know, the last couple of days we've spent a lot of time talking about surface finish. You know, what it is, what surface finish I want, how do you get that surface finish? You know, Ed at Rottler has been a great help in helping us get there. But once you achieve that, and maybe you got a machine shop or you took your block to a machine shop, you got it back, everything's the way you want it, then you got to protect it. You know, we needed that surface finish for a reason, to help us with the whole break-in procedure and all that. But a lot of people tend to miss the fact that there's a pretty tight-knit relationship between the tune-up that the engine's got and the ability of that break-in to take place, you know, in a short amount of time. So Keith, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that guys face when trying to get the right ring with the right surface finish and then keep it that way until it breaks in. What are some of the issues you get?
One of the big ones, Ben, and it's a great point that this has been brought up. You know, you've done all this work, spent the money, you've done the machine work, you've done your research, you've found the right parts, spent all the time, put it all together, stuffed it in the car, we're ready to go. And at this point in time, there was a very, we'll say, narrow, tight little fragile relationship between the ring, the cylinder. The ring is the final hone. It's the final process of getting that cylinder finished just what it wants. It needs a little bit of friction. It needs oil. It needs everything to happen at the right point, right time. We put it together.
So if I was waxing my hot rod, the ring is basically my 1,000 grit wet sand at the end.
This is it.
Right?
We're that final, you know, we're going to color sand it and just get that surface just perfect. That's that last step of that initial break-in. So the thing that we run into it a lot. And it's fuel wash during break-in. We've always been taught, you know, father to son, son to daughter, to their, you know, to their children, that a fat tune-up's a safe tune-up.
Sure.
Well, maybe there's some validity to that. From my side and where I sit, this is nothing but bad. We're introducing too much fuel. We've got a very fragile relationship now between the ring and that cylinder wall, the oil, and we come in and we literally pour a solvent in there. We break the oil film down so it has no ability to lubricate, and we ultimately end up burnishing the cylinder wall. Instead of wearing those fine peaks down and getting that really beautiful finish, we end up rolling all those peaks over and folding the metal. Now, this is easily seen when we take the engine apart. Instead of this nice, bright, silver, shiny, sparkly cylinder finish, we've got this dark, dull black. That's a burnished wall.
So Keith, what usually takes the abuse? Is it the ring or the cylinder wall?
That's an excellent question. It is the cylinder wall. 99% of the time, I've seen the rings that have come back out. They're perfect. There really is no damage to the ring, but we're back apart, back out of the car.
Work over again, right?
We got to hone it again.
Yep.
Put it all back together, and hopefully we'll say on this second or third time around, we've done our due diligence and gotten a good fuel map into this thing, whether it be fuel injected or carbureted. We've got the fuel curve pretty close to right, so now we can get it broken in and get everything seated up and get it happy.
So we have a little drawing behind us where we spent a lot of time talking about the surface finish, the peaks, the valleys, and how that valley is a reservoir for the oil, right? So you kind of drew here, this would be our cylinder wall, and the purple lines are those kind of peaks and valleys. Now the orange in there, that would be the oil that's filling that reservoir. That's what's doing the work of that reservoir.
That's our storage tank.
Yep. So we come in here and we do the old-fashioned safe tune-up. You know, rich is safe and fat is good and everything else. And what you have is the fuel droplets here that are, you know, we're not using them for combustion. So what happens is it becomes a solvent, and that fuel dilutes that oil mixture, basically washes it quickly off the cylinder wall. And now there's nothing to really protect that high friction loading between the cylinder wall and the ring, right?
Damage done.
Yeah, so obviously if a guy just buys a new carburetor and puts it on the engine, it's probably going to run pretty good. Do you see more problems on the carburetor side or the EFI side?
Not to pick on EFI, but I'd say it's probably more to the EFI side, simply because it doesn't have, and you're the expert here.
That means that's great. I got more work to do.
It does not have a proper startup map in it.
Sure.
Many of the guys that I get that we'll say are very much novices, the guys that need to come and see Ben and take the class, myself included, because I'm no expert, will fire this thing up. It's just fat as could be, and 3-4 days, a week, a month later, they're going to finally get it to somebody that can do some tuning on it. Well, at this point in time, the damage is done. But it can happen with a carburetor. I have had the instances where, you know, 14 pounds of fuel pressure is going to lift that needle and seat, and it's going to just be gobbling fuel like it's going out of style.
Yeah,
so
we've all seen that, right? You got too much pressure, it holds the you know, float bowl's full, it holds the needle and seat open, it dumps right in there. So how long do you think it takes on a brand new, perfect, fresh startup? You know, how bad does it have to be? Are we talking like, you know, only a few guys ever see this happen if they get really unlucky? Or is this a common thing, like really washing that oil?
This is a common thing. This is I don't want necessarily say a daily phone call, but certainly a weekly phone call.
That's a lot. I mean, that's 52 times a year.
Yeah, at least. And there's, I will say, there's more than just myself to shop.
Yeah.
So multiply that by at least 3 or 4.
So, you know, I don't want to paint the picture that the engine's delicate per se, but the reality is, I mean, if we're using, you know, microscopic measurements to see how sharp those little peaks are, then it's really not that hard to fold them over rather than, work them in like you're honing that
slowly, let them work their way down, wear them off, not, roll them over.
So we want to be extremely careful about the initial tune-up for the engine, especially with regards to flooding the engine. You know, if that happens, stop. Just, let's take the plugs out. Let's get that fuel out of there.
Absolutely 100%. Again, working with guys, they've talked to them, they've got this problem, it's smoking, it's got blow by, it's got all these, and we discuss, hey, tell me how it went. How did the initial startup go? Oh man, it took us 3 days to get it started. We had fuel running out the tailpipes. It's, wrong pumps, wrong injectors, wrong this, and we finally got it running. Damage done. This is an engine that hasn't even started yet, and it's already been hurt. I
think it's easy for guys to say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that because I have a carburetor. But you know what happens a lot with a carburetor engine is they'll put the distributor in 180 out. So you're cranking and cranking and cranking, and the thing doesn't start. It's popping or banging. Well, the same thing's happening there as if I had a bad tune-up in my startup map for an EFI system.
Absolutely. That draw on the intake stroke is still signaling that carburetor. It's still pulling fuel in, and every time it doesn't start, what are we doing? We're hitting that accelerator pump a few more times, and we're just loading it down with fuel.
So is there any validity or truth to the idea that, oh, well, eventually the rings will seat? Like if I've done that, if I've washed the fuel out, the oil off because of the fuel, will it eventually come around, or am I pretty much...
You're pretty much done.
Okay.
you might get lucky, and if they did come back in 6, 7, 8,000 miles later, I'd tell you go buy a lottery ticket that day, because you're about 1 in a million guys that got lucky enough to have it come back in, because pretty much damage is done.
And so what are the typical symptoms? My engine's sick. What are the symptoms that a guy would have if he had washed the oil off and had trouble with the rings? What are some of the things he could look for?
Typically what we just discussed, we're going to have a blow-by problem in it, but the most prominent or prevalent is an oil control problem.
Okay, we got smoke out the tailpipe.
We've got smoking out of the tailpipe. We've got blow-by because we've literally folded that peak metal down back into the valley, we talked about that reservoir, that trough. Well, I've taken that peak and I've folded it over, so now the valley, it can't hold any oil. It's filled with the other metals.
We
so
capped it, basically.
We capped it. So we basically got such a smooth, burnished surface now. We've lost the ability to hold oil, trap oil. Blow-by numbers are generally going to be higher, not horribly, but typically the sign is we've got an oil control problem that we can't explain. We really shouldn't have an oil control problem.
Maybe a guy's middle of the road engine builder doesn't have, say, a blow-by meter. You'd be looking for things like wet exhaust ports, right? Like you take the headers off and there's oily, just wet stuff in there, oil on the spark plugs, smoke out of the tailpipe, high oil consumption. And another one is do an oil change and sniff the oil, right?
This is perfect. And not to get into too much depth, I had a customer that kept fuel washing the engine, tearing the rings up, 3 different rebuilds. Engine was dynoed. Everything was fantastic, no issues. Well, at the end of this whole cycle, come to find out, the guy's not running the carburetor that was on the dyno.
There you go. Yeah.
He sends me the oil. I'm like, dude, you got to send me the oil. I want the oil straight out of the car. Don't do anything to it. Send me the rings again. Let me look at them. He sent me a little Pepsi bottle full of oil, and I was going to send it out to Speed Diagnostics to have it checked, but I didn't need to, because after it sat on my desk for an hour, the fuel settled out of the oil, and it was like, C12.
Yeah, no smoking, right?
No smoking in here. And that all came down to the place that dynoed the engine ran on their dyno carburetor, which was fantastic.
Sure.
A Holley carburetor.
Take that off, though, and now you go
and
home.
Put on a Quadrajet.
Sure, yeah. Or even another Holley that maybe wasn't tuned good or whatever, right? But so that's interesting that you bring that up, because a week or so ago, I was actually doing some back-to-back testing on an engine with a brand new, one of those really slick Generation 3, they call them Gen 3 Holley Dominators. I don't know if you've seen them, they are slick.
Yep.
But a little, like a week and a half ago, Holley released a new product that was called the Terminator X, where it uses like a carburetor-looking EFI throttle body. It looks identical to the carburetor, except it's EFI. And so I did some testing back-to-back on the same engine, and what I wanted to see was like, A, is there any difference in power between them? Obviously, that's what everybody wants to know. But really what I want to know is, how much work is it going to take me to get these things to run? So what I want to do is take you guys to the back, and I got both of them on the bench next to each other, kind of taking apart a little bit, and walk you through the differences between carburetor and EFI, and then talk a little bit about the relationship of how we're going to get that tune up right. And I'll just do spoiler alert now. Ultimately, they pretty much made identical power, but that's kind of what you'd expect from a carburetor type throttle body and a carburetor.
Yeah.
The difference was, holy cow, was it a lot of work to get that carburetor to be as good as the EFI in really short order. We made a couple of hits on the dyno, boom, that thing was running. And I'll show you guys how we do that. But ultimately, it wasn't so much I thought there was going to be a big difference in power. What I wanted to know is how much work it was going to take to get a tune-up that was acceptable. And I think one of the things that's happened in the industry is what a great time to be in the racing industry, what a great time to be alive, because the technology has come to a point where we don't have to do that much anymore. You know what I mean? Like, we've come to think, carburetor tuning is easy. Well, it's not that carburetor tuning is easy. It's just that when you got it out of the box, most of it was already done for you. We have 80 or 100 years of guys tweaking and tuning carburetors. So the end product that a guy gets now is so good, you can put it on 10 different engines and it'll fire right up and run and go. And maybe you tweak a jet here, power valve there, whatever. But for the most part, the real work was already done. Not so much with EFI. I mean, EFI's been around good 20, 30, 40 years now, but the state of refinement isn't anywhere near what a carburetor is. And so I think what is largely a problem for you guys is people start out with this idea for a project, they build this whole engine, they probably listened to a couple of your seminars and they went and talked to their machinists and they got all that stuff right, but they didn't really have the knowledge or skills available to get that refined tune-up to hit go, and that thing fires up and starts. And I think that's where a lot of that kind of fuel distribution issue, fuel washing the cylinders came from. But what's exciting about some of these new products is Holley realized that was a problem. And who better to realize it than Holley, who does nothing but make fuel systems. So they said, what if we could give you an EFI system that not only looked and acted like a carburetor, but you could start it up and get your car running as easily as you did with a carburetor. And so they did a fantastic job with that. I was very impressed. If you want, we can walk to the back of the shop and I'll take a couple apart and show you, and we'll talk about it a little bit.
Love to see it.
All right, let's go check it out. Hey guys, okay, check it out. We're back in the shop here, and I've got a couple examples of new generation Holley equipment that could maybe make your life a little bit easier in terms of getting starting up and running quickly and accurately as fast as possible. Now, whether you're a carburetor guy at heart and you'll never change, or you embrace the new technology and you're really interested in the EFI stuff, I got a little bit of both to show you. So I thought I'd take a couple minutes and point out a few cool things. So on this side, what I have is an 1150 CFM Gen 3 Ultra Dominator from Holley. Really, really nice improvements they made in these carburetors in terms of the way that they're radiused in here now, the way the air bleeds are all located easy to get to. They even added an idle air bleed like on an EFI car where you've got an idle air adjustment that you can make. You basically can go right here in the middle of the carburetor, and there's 4 holes that go around. I don't know if you guys can see those or not, but those are basically adjustable amount of air that you can use to get the idle speed you want. Rather than the old-fashioned way to come over here and grab the idle stop and turn that, the reason that you don't want to do that is even though it's raising the throttle blade and giving you more airflow, it's changing the relationship of the throttle blade to the idle transfer slot in there. And then what happens is as you start to open the throttle, you get a lean or a dead spot there as you've used up most of that idle transfer slot, and there's not quite enough signal yet to start pulling on the main circuit. So this is what we call a 3-circuit carburetor. It's got an idle circuit, an intermediate circuit, and of course a main circuit, rather than just an idle and a main circuit on a 2-circuit carburetor. But Holley made some really nice improvements to those areas there. And you know, one of the things that I mentioned when I was in there talking to Keith about how simple it seems like it is to tune a carburetor is that most of the work has already been done. You take a look at just how elegantly complex a carburetor really is. Now on this Gen 3 Ultra Dominator, they have billet metering blocks. The metering block is the part that actually is doing most of the work to get the tune-up right. And, you know, you got, obviously, for those of you young guys that don't know a lot about carburetors, I'll just start from the beginning. You have the fuel bowl. That's basically my reservoir. So my fuel line comes in, and there's a needle and a seat right here, a spring-loaded valve, basically. The fuel comes in, it goes past that valve. Now, on the back side, it's got a float. And as this bowl fills up, that float raises, and it basically pushes that needle and seat and closes it off. So now my fuel just waits there until the engine uses up the fuel and the float sinks. That valve opens back up, and so this float basically acts like a governor. So the first thing a guy wants to do with his carburetor is make sure that the float setting, the height of that, is properly. And they got little glass windows here that you can look on the side. So what you want is the fuel level, when the car's level or the engine's level, to be about the middle of that window. What can happen if you get a little piece of trash in there is that that needle and seat can't close. Well, when that happens, it just keeps filling the fuel bowl, which then transfers that fuel out of the bowl in this vent, and it tends to go over here and pretty much flood the engine. So when Keith and I were talking about protecting that cylinder finish, that's one of those things you want to watch out for. So you can grab a wrench and a screwdriver, and you can unscrew this and actually pull that needle and seat out and remove any debris in there. So that's really a good thing to check before you go to start the engine, or in this case, even turn your fuel pump on. And make sure that your float levels are set correctly. That way you're not dumping a bunch of raw fuel in the engine, washing that fuel off the cylinder wall, and then our rings can't see. So that's the first thing. Then we talk about, well, geez, you know, carburetors, just take them out of the box and they work. Well, they only work so well because for the last 60 or 80 or 100 years, companies like Holley and other tuners have made all the adjustments necessary. So if you just look at how complicated this little metering block is for a second, think about what's going on here, you might understand what I'm talking about. So most people who have ever looked at a carburetor are familiar with the main jets. That's these two guys here. What these are is a calibrated orifice that you can screw in, and they're interchangeable. Holley makes tons and tons of different size jets that are precisely made. They're broached, and then they're flowed and measured to make sure they're just perfect. So what you don't want to do is go in there with a drill bit and hog those things out and make them bigger, because then you can't really control precisely the amount of fuel flow you've actually got. But you can go up or down in sizes, and that basically takes care of the overall amount of fuel that the engine gets in any of the, you know, the basic driving conditions. So it's kind of a gross change. Next to it, there's these tiny little restrictors here. I don't know if you guys can see them super well here, but these are our intermediate circuit restrictors. And basically they're a little jet that determines how much fuel or how much air is going to get into that intermediate circuit. And then if we turn around to the other side, we see this thing here. This is called a power valve. It's basically a an engine vacuum actuated sort of high power fuel circuit. If I unscrew it here, you can see what happens is, I'm going to take the little gasket off. There's a hole where fuel can get through, and inside here there's two little jet restrictors that can also be tuned. You can take a screwdriver, you can put it in there and unscrew that, and you can put a bigger or a smaller restrictor there. That's called a power valve restrictor channel. And what a lot of people don't know is that the numbers on the power valve, for example, this one's got a 5.5. Well, that indicates when the fuel gets delivered through that high power circuit, not necessarily how much. I've heard people talk about, oh, I've got a high flow power valve, so I'm going to get more fuel. You're really not, because it's the size of the orifice and the power valve channel restriction that controls how much fuel you get. Your power valve, for example, this one's 5.5, means that whenever the engine vacuum is below 5.5 inches, meaning when you open the throttle, that's when this spring-loaded vacuum actuated circuit will open, and at any manifold vacuum below that value, it'll supply fuel from the circuit through those channel restrictions. But having a bigger or a smaller number of power valves is not going to give you more fuel, just earlier or later delivery to that fuel. Along the side here, there's a
Again, Lake Speed Jr. along with my friend Ben Strader, who you just heard from, talking all about the differences between carbs and EFI. And we had a little special guest there at the very beginning, Keith Jones, talking about how tune-up, back to Warren Johnson talking earlier today, you can't tune it up if it's blown up, how that tune-up makes a big difference in break-in. Now, Ben, we already have a ton of questions, so let's just go ahead and dive right in to the questions right now. So the first one was, what's your opinion of Quick Seat? Of course, I work for Total Seal, but I believe you've used it some, so I'll let you tee that one up and go first, and then I'll maybe finish it up if we have any other details.
Well, I probably have less experience using it than most guys, because I mean, obviously I've worked together with the Total Seal guys for a while, and we're always trying different stuff, but obviously pretty much every product that we have used and tried, I would say, other than maybe some things that we tried that we thought might be a good idea and ended up not being, for the most part, if it's being on the shelf and sold out there, you're going to be pretty happy with the results of it. And certainly every time I've used it, it's been great. But you know, at the risk of being the latest hire salesman at Total Seal Lake, I'm happy to let you field that if you want.
Sure. So a couple of questions about Quick Seat. So one of the questions was, how do you use it? So the idea of Quick Seat is it's a dry film lubricant. As we put an engine together, there is static ring tension. Of course, as you assemble the motor and get it ready to go to the dyno, there's going to be some cylinder pressure as you turn the engine over. Well, that slow rotation with that static tension, oil can't build that oil wedge. We talked about it earlier and some yesterday, that hydrodynamic oil film, that's not forming when that boat's going slow. That perfect background there, the Ben's boat, that at the no wake zone, you're going slow, you don't build that big, thick film. So Quick Seat, being a dry film lubricant, gives you good lubrication, protection of your finely honed cylinder bore, of your light, tight, finished piston rings. But then it protects all those things. But there's another benefit to Quick Seat as well, so that you're not only getting that proper protection until the oil can come up and do its job, it's also an indicator of cleanliness. So one of the things about Quick Seat is it comes out of the package black, kind of a grayish blackish film. And as you rub it in the cylinder wall, if that cylinder wall is clean, it will turn green. So we know that cleanliness is next to godliness in most places. So the idea of having a clean cylinder bore so there's not contamination in there to damage that finish, to damage the ring, which would hurt ring seal long term. And you heard Perry yesterday at ACT saying that even with the machine, it can only get about 80% or 50% of that oil out. You still have to get the rest of that oil out. And honing oil, that residue, is going to contain little bitty tiny abrasive pieces that can do damage that you don't want done. You want to control the amount of wear for break-in. You don't want it to run wild. So the idea of Quick Seat is if the cylinder isn't green when you apply it, it's not clean, so you know you need to go back and keep on cleaning it until it does turn green. So with that, let's
one thing to add there about the Quick Seat stuff is there's plenty of information on what it will do for you and why it's great, but it's probably really important to point out what it won't do, and that is it's not magic. It's not going to fix bad bore geometry. It's not going to fix rings that aren't light tight. It's not going to fix improper crosshatch in the hone. It's not a fix-all for that kind of stuff. It's an added a benefit when you get all that stuff right. So kind of important to make the distinction.
Well said. It's not going to fix having too rich of your idle circuit so that you wash the cylinders down anyway. So it's all those things. So there were some questions about using a dry sump setup. Would that affect the RVK ring seal because of the vacuum? And would a larger, I think he meant RVK, prevent washout?
Well, I personally treat our dry sump engines differently than our wet sump engines when we hone them. But it's not just dry versus wet. It's also like all the other things that have been talked about a lot. It's fuel type, it's application, it's ring package. Having a dry sump on an engine that's got big giant rings in it is different than having a dry sump with little 20 by 85 rings. And a lot of that, again, is cylinder pressure based and RPM based. If you have a really large engine that does really low RPM versus a small engine doing high RPM, I think it's one of those things that the devil's in the details. It's the variables that matter. And so, if I just had an engine that was running and I took the oil pan off and put a dry sump on it, is the RVK value really going to make all that much difference? Maybe not. It's the combination of parts and systems and processes that make a killer engine, not just the one thing. It's not the trick of the weak plug.
Wait, you mean it's ring seal soup? Sorry, I had to say that. It is. It's the combination, and the ring seal soup's my favorite analogy. If you've been watching for the last 2 days, you already know that. So, a couple more questions here. One of the questions was, can you touch on restarting a motor that was in off-season storage? I assume that the oil would run out of the valleys over the winter, and I assume that relying on splash from a primer for primer would be insufficient. I know just from my NASCAR experience that with a dry sump engine, it's always a benefit to go pull the belt off the pump, spin it with a drill to make sure you get oil flow. That's a great way of doing it. Now, that's not always possible on a wet sump engine. What are your thoughts about that after an engine's been in storage for a while?
Well, we get a lot of that because unlike a normal engine shop, most of the engines that we have here for our R&D program at the school, it's the same engine that we use all the time, but we don't use the engines all the time. So we might run a few tests here and there. and it might sit for 6 months or 8 months before we have another test to do while we work on other engines. And so I do agree with that. I mean, luckily, a lot of the stuff we have is dry sump, so we just pull that belt off and we prime it up just like it was a brand new engine again. But I also think there's something to be said for, an engine that's already been broken and had been through that whole break-in process is probably a little less scary to me than maybe a brand new one. But like on the wet sump stuff, we'll do the same thing you would normally do for a new engine. We'll make sure we get it up to oil pressure, get that oil moving around a bunch. Oil temperature matters a lot. Yep. So there's no magic to it. It's not like there's any secrets to making that happen after you've been sitting all winter. It's the same thing. We pull the covers off. We go through the valve train, valve springs, fresh oil, make sure it's lubed up and primed. I mean, no magic, nothing crazy there. But when it's been sitting for a while, I just assume it's like a new engine and do all the things I normally would, other than it's not necessarily got to go through a break-in process again.
That's a really, really great advice. Think about it as a new engine, just doesn't require the break-in. Talking about storage, I want to make a little comment that this is something that's come up several times, even in conversation around here at the Expo off camera the last couple of days, is what's the right way to store an engine? And I can say that one of the worst things you can do is go out there and crank that engine up every few weeks or so during storage, because you think you're trying to get the oil moving around. If you crank that engine up and don't bring it all the way up to operating temperature, what's going to happen is you're going to put more fuel, more moisture, more contamination really into the oil, which is going to damage the engine. I've actually even seen that on used oil analysis, that there are some shops where they have very cramped space to work on cars, and the employees were driving the cars around the parking lots every day to try to maintain, the shuffle, the Tetris, if you will, to keep things going. But that short trip driving every day would drive the fuel dilution way up. Then you could see higher levels of wear in the engine on the used oil analysis from that. Consequently, the employees had to stop driving cars and start pushing cars.
Like in terms of, you start up a car that's cold. Look how much moisture and water comes out the tailpipe from the condensation. Mm-hmm. I mean, realistically, that's the same thing that's going on inside the engine. If you can see it outside the engine, it's happening inside the engine. So,
right.
If we're going to start them up, we need to let them run long enough to get hot and stay hot long enough to kind of get rid of all that moisture in there. But probably better off not doing.
Oh, exactly. So a couple more questions here. Okay, here's a stock eliminator engine question. With stock ring grooves required by the rules using back cut rings, other than getting a ring groove built in the piston for them, do you use shim stock and reduce back clearance, or just leave that extra back clearance in the piston? What are your thoughts on that, Ben? I have an opinion that I'm going to relate from my friend Keith Jones. I'm just going to speak for Keith since he couldn't be here today, but I'll let you tee that up first.
Well, back clearance is an important part of making the ring do what we want. So it's not necessarily something I would ever ignore. In that case, if we're building some shim stock and trying to use a smaller ring than the ring groove, it would be a mistake, I think, to only think about the axial and not also the radial dimensions of that package. And so, I definitely think you want to pay attention to what's going on there.
Yeah, to Keith's answer is going to be you want to have as little back clearance as you can, but like most things in life, it's the Goldilocks and the Three Bears rule. You don't want too much, you don't want too little, you want it just right. So the ability to have shim stock to adjust that back clearance to get it just right for your application will give you that next little bit. What WJ was talking about this morning, it's all those little details. When you get into those classes where the big gains have already been had, now you're down to those little things, and back clearance and getting it right is one of them. So let's move on to some other questions. One of the questions was, if a wideband O2 is in play during break-in, do you have a danger AFR number, right? Not being too rich, I think is what we're trying to go at. Is it 13 to 1? Is it 12 to 1? Should it be the same for a carb or an EFI?
Carb versus EFI is pretty irrelevant because the pistons don't know that fuel came out of an injector or out of a jet. So realistically, I don't treat the tune-up for the engine any different, carbs versus EFI, to start with. That being said, is there a magic AFR number? it's certainly, when we're talking about the possibility of doing damage to the cylinder walls and ring package, we're certainly on the extreme end of that rich scale. If we're talking about gasoline as a fuel type, something below 10 is probably really scary. I mean, the reality is if you're sitting there puffing black smoke and soot out the tailpipe on a gasoline powered engine, you probably have a lot of particulate matter to be worried about. That's upstream of the opening there. That said, the reality is you have to get pretty extremely rich before you start not having combustion. If it's misfiring because it's so rich, you're probably going to get yourself in trouble there. But for the most part, if you're 11 and a half, 12, 12 and a half, 13, if you're somewhere between, 12 and 14, you're going to have a hard time hurting anything performance-wise there, in my opinion. So I think probably people get a little too carried away with the numbers on the wideband. And what I mean by that is too many decimal points. Is it 12.5 or is it 12.5236? And so the reality is we didn't know what it was before we had a wideband. We were all smart enough to look at the engine, listen to the engine, hear it, and look at the tailpipe and go, oh, geez, it's bellowing black smoke out the back. That's got to be too rich. That can't be good, So not really anything has changed there other than the fact that now that we have data, we have to be careful not to be so zoomed in on the data that it just becomes a video game where the end goal is to get the screen to pop up with a number that we like, rather than the end goal is to get the engine to perform the way that we like. And so I think the wideband is a double-edged sword in that regard sometimes.
Ooh, I love that analogy of not making it a video game where you're just trying to hit a number. You're trying to get the engine to run right. The numbers are just the tools we use to get the engine to run right. One of the things, kind of in relation to this, our buddy Don McCaskill, who's the dyno guy at Shaver Specialties, who will be doing a video with me tomorrow. Make sure you come back tomorrow to watch that. That one of the things that Don does with their injected methanol engines during break-in is they actually take the fuel valve and they partially close it. So because it's mechanical constant flow injection, it would be very easy to make the engine have too much fuel during break-in. They've already learned to not have fuel wash, to not kill the rings, to not kill their cylinder finish. They close that fuel valve slightly in order to, and I'm sure it leans the engine out a little bit, but without having any load on it, when they're okay to do that. So it's like you said, it's controlling that environment so you don't get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, you think about that statement. I always ask a lot of my students, I say, how lean would you have to get the engine to where you could melt the pistons at idle? And the reality is you can't. The worst possible thing that could happen at idle if you don't have enough fuel is it'll stumble and die. If you could make enough temperature at idle to melt a piston, then it doesn't matter what air fuel ratio you use at wide open power, wide open throttle, you're going to make more heat than you'll be able to control. So the reality is, we have way more chance of damaging the engine being way excessively rich at idle than you do lean.
Perfect. So a couple more questions here. One of them was from Joe Anderson. What will protect cylinder walls while the block is sitting waiting on parts? Now, of course, that happens sometimes. Parts don't show up when you want them to, or you have to wait amount of time to get the custom part you want made. Well, the biggest thing is, I know at Gibbs, they use a product called SimGuard. I'm not sure if you've ever used the SimGuard, Ben, but the SimGuard's got a great rust inhibitor. I mean, you can use WD-40 as well. I know some guys do that, but it's really important.
A lot of guys use Marvel Mystery Oil, lots of different stuff out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do that. The key is that if you're using that as a rust preventative, during storage, that's actually not the ideal lubricant for when you go fire it up for break-in. But just know that in your mind that you don't want to put too much in there. That a lot of times in racing industry, people think, oh, if one is good, well, two must be better. So
one is better.
Yeah, that's definitely not the case. One of the things that I wanted to kind of touch on, Ben, is that you shared a lot of information with us over the last couple of segments. If people are interested in this topic, if they really want to go to that next level, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your competition engine development classes, because I've been fortunate enough to come help teach those classes with you. Why don't you give the people listening a little bit of an idea of what happens at a competition engine development class? Because in my opinion, That's kind of phase 2. If you're liking the Engine Performance Expo, the virtual learning, that's level 1. Level 2 is putting your hands on the product.
Well, thanks, Lake. I mean, that's unexpected and appreciated. Anytime we can pump our little, give a bump to our school, that's great. But, what I really did with the competition engine development program is I built the kind of school, the kind of hands-on training environment that, frankly, I would want to go to. I looked around and I thought, geez, I have a really privileged career in life. The people I get to know and hang out with, you guys and Billy and Kazi and all the greats, that I've got to learn from, and working in all these different cool professional racing venues. And I thought, the problem with this is that it becomes tribal knowledge. It only gets passed down person to person and not on a really large scale. And so the problem is, if you're a 16, 18, 20-year-old kid, or heck, 35 or 40-year-old racer, and you go, man, how am I going to learn that? You can't just walk into a pro stock engine shop or a NASCAR Cup facility and say, hey, you guys mind if I hang out for a couple days and look around and see what you're doing and learn some of the things that have to go into building a professional level competition engine? And I just thought, that's a real shame, And so what I did is back, I think we actually started that program really in about 2013 or 14, but back then it was more about, how to build engines and stuff like that. And I realized that's not really where the market wanted to be. I mean, most people understand you turn the bolts to the right and they get tight, and you turn to the left and they get loose. I mean, the mechanics of building an engine, not that big of a secret. What seems to be the most lacking part in the racing industry is the idea that you could take a clean sheet of paper and design and develop a true racing and competition engine and get it right without 30 years of trial and error. And so, we tried to say, well, what's the difference between, just engine building and competition level engine testing and development? And so we built a class that you can come to it. We show you how we start in the classroom and we use logic and math and science, and then we end up out in the lab physically doing it hands-on. But I wanted to make sure that our students were going to be working on a level of engine, like in the race technology that's going on in the shop, that was cutting edge enough that when they leave our place, they can know what it takes to be competitive in real life. And so, that means we're working on the latest technology in valve trains with Billy. We're working on the latest technology with the piston companies, with the ring guys at Total Seal, with the oil companies. All the stuff that's being developed in the technology side is happening in our shop when we're not doing classes. A lot of our revenue structure is getting revenue for doing testing and research and development for both race teams and parts and manufacturers. So I joke and I say we teach the things that we most want to learn, or we learn the things we most want to teach, but that's partially true. We're constantly doing research and development and working for real race teams in real life, mostly so that we can take that technology and transfer it right into our classroom so that guys could come and not only talk about stuff and get access and see stuff that maybe they haven't known about before, but physically get to put their hands on it and do it. So almost every single person at every level that's come through that course has left just going, wow, I would have paid twice as much if I would have known that was the stuff I was going to get exposed to. And it's not just all, fluff. It's not just, hey, here's some pictures of my Spintron. Like, half the time, if there's something going on in the shop that's R&D project, we'll run the Spintron with the students. I've had students actually participate and help build competition engines that, a week later I was at the racetrack helping the customer drag race with. So pretty amazing opportunity that I wish existed 20 years ago or 25 years ago when I was coming up, because I would have been the first one in line to go to that school.
Well, I've been right behind you. And the funny thing is, that's how you and I got to know each other and started working together.
Absolutely.
Was doing just that kind of work. Curriculum for engine development, but also doing that private testing that you can't do outside of a cop shop normally, but yes, you can. You just got to go to Lake Havasu City, Arizona to do it.
I'll never forget the first time you came by the shop and you kind of like walked in the door and set your bags down. You looked around for a minute and you just had this sort of like wide eyes and kind of, looking around, and I thought, oh boy, he doesn't like it, and you go, holy cow, this place is really legit. And I was like, wow, here's a guy that's been around, you know, all the biggest name shops in the country and worked in NASCAR facilities, and he thinks our facility is pretty cool. And all of a sudden I was like, huh, that was a huge compliment, whether you knew it or not. But since that time, we worked on a lot of pretty amazing stuff together and learned. I can't even tell you how much we've actually learned. It's been a pretty good ride, and I'm stoked that every single time we learn something, you know, less than a month later, guys in our class are learning about that same thing right behind us. So that's pretty cool. Such a rare, unique thing in our industry that's largely built on keeping secrets. To be able to come and learn that stuff is pretty neat. I'm a little jealous of these guys.
Well, that is pretty neat. Like you said, we can almost feel the tide turning in a sense that, you know, WJ was here earlier, and his career was all about keeping it secret. Find the advantage,
Absolutely.
Hold the advantage, and now you've got people like him sitting there beginning to share some of those advantages. And he didn't tell us everything, but that's fine. But we're pointing down that direction because I think really what I take away from the concept of the Engine Performance Expo, what you're doing there at EFI University, it's all about empowerment. You can do this. Somebody out there will be the next.
I mean, the reality is, you know, what used to make the tech seminars when you'd go to PRI and you'd go to the ATEC and all that, and what used to make all that special was the opportunity to have real life relationships. And so probably one of the coolest things that came out of the COVID era, if you will, is this actual Engine Performance Expo, because it's giving people an opportunity with the videos to get information, but with this live Q&A stuff to actually kind of have a little bit of that relationship building potential still left. And let's be honest, I mean, every one of us that's here can only attribute our success to the relationships and the people that have helped us get where we're at. Because I know for sure I wouldn't have been able to do any of the things I've done if it wasn't for guys like you and Keith and Billy and, you know, and Kazi and all the guys that, you know, put their arm around me and kept me from doing stupid stuff before I hurt myself. But that's a great thing that, you know, I think it was Chuck that said earlier, Chuck Lynch said, we live in the information age. So now I feel like it's our responsibility to make sure that the information that's getting out there is the right information, not just information, but actual valuable stuff that people can use.
So true, so true. So back to more information conveying. We got a couple questions left to try to get to before we got to wrap it up and go to the next segment. One of the questions was, do you think it would be an advantage to basically spin the engine over without spark plugs and things like that to try to help to break the rings in? I'm going to say no. I mean, I know there's something called a sim tester, because to me it's all about what you talk about in the video. It's heat and load. You have to have cylinder pressure. You got to have heat. The best thing that can create both heat and cylinder pressure is a combustion action. That combustion is going to make heat, going to make load. That's what's going to help break the rings in. Your thoughts, Ben?
My thought is pretty similar. I mean, if you think about the reality is there's not enough mechanical tension in the compression rings pushing against the cylinder wall all by themselves to seal the engine up. They rely heavily on the combustion pressure getting in that groove and behind that ring and pushing it out, expanding against the cylinder wall. So it makes no sense to me to crank the engine over with no or relatively no cylinder pressure other than your cranking compression. Well, I guess you wouldn't even have that if you had the spark plugs out. So I guess the bottom line is no. Without any help from the cylinder pressure, you're probably just prolonging the amount of time it's going to take to get that ring to do what it needs to do. So I'm a big fan of more cylinder pressure earlier in the process.
All right, great. One last question. It asks about making sure when you store a car and put it away, don't use stainless or mild steel headers or to clean them out. You need to stay tuned for tomorrow and listen to John Kazi, because we won't touch any more on that. We won't steal it from John. We'll let John demonstrate that. So now, Ben, thank you for being with us. You know what? In the famous words of Alan Jackson, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Let's throw it to Joe Costello.
What a day, what a day, what a day. My brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.